please explain Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. Well, again, we have to go to the context. It reads like this. It says, remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. And behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. This was written about 400 years before Jesus was born. And this was the last voice of the prophets of the Old Testament before Jesus came to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament. Now, he says very clearly, I'm going to send you Elijah, and he is going to clear the way for you. Isaiah speaks of the ministry of being a herald for Jesus also when he talks about this. In Isaiah, he says that in chapter 40, behold the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, make his path straight. That was a prophecy. He didn't name him. That was a prophecy about John the Baptist, who came in the spirit and power of Elijah. Let me see if I can put this together, because once again, you asked a great question, but it has a complex answer. You see, this was confusing to the apostles. It was even confusing to John the Baptist. Now, it says in Matthew chapter 17, beginning with verse 10, and his disciples asked him, that is Jesus, saying, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? In other words, Elijah must come first before the Messiah comes and sets up the kingdom. And Jesus answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. Now, he's just been talking about John the Baptist. And John the Baptist was put to death. And so they were confused, and they said, we were supposed to see Elijah come. If you're really the Messiah, Elijah was supposed to come first. That's what the Pharisees teach. And Jesus says this, and don't forget this verse, verse 11. And Jesus answered and said, Elijah is coming, future. Elijah is truly going to come in the future and will restore all things. In other words, Malachi's prophecy is still valid, not fulfilled yet, but will be fulfilled absolutely. And he says then in verse 12, but I say to you that Elijah already came, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. Here's something that gets into the foreknowledge of God. He has omniscience. He knows all things, both possible and probable. He knows all things before they happen. And so God made this prophecy. And so when Jesus came the first time, he didn't send Elijah. Why? Because he knew that the Jewish leaders and the majority of the Israelis were not going to receive Jesus and believe in him so that he could restore and he could establish the kingdom that he had promised in the covenants of the Old Testament. But in order to make valid the offer of the kingdom that Jesus made, he did send John the Baptist, and it's very clearly said several times, in the spirit and power of Elijah. Bear with me now. I'm going to turn now to Matthew chapter 11, and beginning in verse 2. In this passage, even John the Baptist was getting confused. So I'm going to read this. Please bear with me and read with me, will you? Now, when John in prison heard of the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else? John couldn't understand. He knew that he was sent to prepare the way for the Messiah to appear. He knew that Jesus was the Messiah. And yet, instead of setting up the kingdom, as the Old Testament prophecies indicated would happen, he's put in prison, and he's trying to figure out, how does all this fit together? You see, what John couldn't see is that in the Old Testament, sometimes within the same paragraph, there's a prophecy of the Messiah coming the first time and being rejected, and a prophecy of the Messiah coming at a second time in order to fulfill and set up the promised kingdom. And he couldn't see the great parenthesis that would be between the first and the second coming, because he only thought of a first coming. So the Messiah comes as the suffering servant the first time, and as the conquering king the second time. And all of this, of course, to those who are just looking at the prophecies in the Old Testament, was hard to discern. It's kind of like today. You have people arguing about, will Christ come for the church first and then later come in the second coming to the earth to set up the kingdom promised to Israel? And there are those who say it's impossible. There can't be a secret coming of Christ and then later a coming to the earth. Well, it's the same dilemma that they faced in the Old Testament. But the Scriptures clearly said it. Looking at it in retrospect, we can see how it was there all along. But they couldn't quite unravel it. And same way with the rapture. It's there. And if you take the Scripture literally, you see that the rapture and the second coming couldn't be the same event, because there are different things that happen that are very much in contrast. John the Baptist asked, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who keeps from stumbling over me." He quotes a prophecy from Isaiah chapter 35, and it's very interesting that he stops in the middle of that prophecy and doesn't go on. And this is something Jesus did at least 2 or 3 times. I know of 2 times. In verse 4, "Say to those with anxious hearts, take courage and fear not. Behold, our God will come with vengeance. The recompense of God will come, and he will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. And the scorched land will become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals its resting place. Grass becomes reeds and rushes, and a highway will be there, a roadway, and it will be called the highway of holiness. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for him who walks that way, and fools will not wander on it." Notice, this is a prophecy that is going to be fulfilled when the Messiah comes to set up the kingdom. But the first part of this is a double reference prophecy. The first part's already been fulfilled. Now notice, Jesus quotes in his answer to John's question, "Are you the one that should come, or should we look for another?" He says in verse 4 again, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Now notice, he only quotes part of that prophecy, but it's the part of the prophecy that's being fulfilled. He didn't talk about the Israelites being brought back from their